Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Dearson and I am the Events and Marketing Executive at Charity Digital. I'll be your host for today's session and would like to give you all a very warm welcome. Today's session on AI is sponsored by the Public Interest Registry and the .org Learning Centre. PIR powers the .org domain name with a clear mission to be an exemplary domain name registry, provide a trusted digital identity, and help educate those who dedicate themselves to improving our world. The session itself will be delivered by Phil Dearson, Digital Director at WPNC. The session will cover the history and future of artificial intelligence, different types of AI and how charities can use it, and finally, the ethical implications of using AI. Before handing over to Phil, I just wanted to share a few house rules. This session will be recorded, meaning that the recording of the session, the presentation, and other resources will be made available to you within a week's time, so don't worry if you've missed something. We love when our webinar sessions are interactive, so please do feel free to add any comments and share your experience and top tips in the chat section, as we'd love to hear from you. Also, please ask lots of questions at any time during and after the presentation by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for Phil to address at the end. And if there's a particular question you'd like answered, you can also upvote questions within the Q&A section. Finally, if you encounter any sound or image issues, please let us know in the chat, and we'll do our very best to get back to normal as soon as we can. Without further ado, let me hand over to Phil.
Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for attending today. If you don't already know me, my name's Phil Dearson. I'm the Digital Director at an agency called WPNC. We only work with charities. We do TV advertising, direct mail, and I look after all the digital activity at the organisation. So that's donor insight, what can we tell about who these people are, how they behave, what their motivations are, etc. Strategy. What should you do given the rapidly expanding world of digital possibilities? Then development, that's making stuff, and marketing, telling people about things, getting people into your funnel, into your ecosystem. But I'm not here to talk about us today. I'm here to talk about AI. So before we get started, it's always it's quite difficult when you're talking about technology to a group of people that you've never met before to know what kind of level to pitch it at. So we've got a couple of polls throughout this little session to give me a little bit of feedback on exactly what things I should be spending more time on and what things I should be spending less time on. So if we could just start with the first poll, please. We'll give you a few minutes to look at it. So which, for those of you watching the recording, I don't think you can actually see this. Hello from the past, by the way. So the question is, which of the following best describes your organization's approach to AI? And then we have some options. We don't know where to start. We're doing general research by this webinar. Some individuals are doing some experimentation on their own. We're actively working on a strategy at the moment, or we have completed that and we have a plan. Or even further down the track, we are implementing our plan. And for those of you that are actually physically present today, temporarily present, if your status doesn't really fit into one of those categories, please do feel free to stick that in the chat and select other, and that will give me a bit of an idea of exactly what level of advancement I should be focusing on during the rest of the chat. Oh, that was quick. Okay, so it looks like the majority of people, so over 50% of you, are currently doing general research into the area, things like this webinar. So this is timely. The next highest category after that, at about 30%, is there are a few individuals doing some experimentation, which sounds totally reasonable. The next one after that, they go down quite rapidly after this. So 13% of people don't really know where to start. You will do by the end of this. And then we've got a really long tail of almost inconsequential responses, 3%, 1%, where people are actively working on a strategy. So it looks like very much people in the exploratory phase of this. Okay, Great. Well, that means I've more or less pitched this at the right level. So let's start with what is AI? Because there are a number of misconceptions, really, when it comes to this field. One thing I want to say before we get into this is I've been helping organizations adapt what it is they do and who they do it for when it comes to emerging technologies ever since the web was created. Now, some of the patterns that we've seen with emerging technologies over time since the creation of the web, we're seeing some of those patterns again. So I want to be able to give you a little bit of reassurance and some concrete steps about what you can actually do about it. So we'll be looking at what is AI and what isn't it? What are some of the concrete benefits for charities? We'll be looking at the future of AI, ethics, and then we have some very concrete recommendations for you at the end. And I want to try and leave as much time as possible for Q&A, so we might have about 20 minutes for that at the end. My email address is on there as well, so if you want to contact me to clarify any of this stuff or talk about specific opportunities for your organization, then of course feel free. So what is AI? One of the important things to understand straight away is that AI isn't a thing. So lots of people, and you'll see this, it's kind of become the common way that we talk about technology now, particularly if you go into LinkedIn, you'll say there's an AI for this and AI for that. These are not AIs. AI it's easier to be thought of as a field of study, like physics, for example. So you can't say, oh, look, we have a physics. Our organization has got a physics. It's a field of study. And the aim of this field is to simulate human capabilities. So we're not creating brand new intelligences here. This is about simulating the things that humans can already do. And we'll go to some specific examples soon. But the field of study is really, really comprehensive, and it overlaps with a whole bunch of other fields of studies. So of course, things like computer science and mathematics, but it also is intersecting with things like cognitive science, the study of how the mind works, philosophy, and we'll touch on that when we come back to ethics, neuroscience, linguistics, and many other areas. So artificial intelligence as a field of study designed to simulate human capabilities means that we do need to consider all these other aspects of what goes into making a human. A little bit of terminology to clear up before we go on. So there are lots of different types of AI, if you like. The things you see in the movie are AGI, so that's artificial general intelligence. We're nowhere near that. So the whole notion of an AGI is something that has reasoning capabilities of its own. It's approaching sentience in a way. So it's kind of the science fiction end of this particular field. What you're probably more used to is things like narrow AI. So narrow AI will be focusing on a very specific human capability more often than not. So vision might be one. Being able to do things like facial recognition, that would be the function of a narrow AI. Grammar, any of you that have used Grammarly in order to enhance or correct your work, your written work, that is a type of narrow AI. Translation programs, audio processing kit, stuff that does automatic data visualization. These are all forms of narrow AI, so focused on a very specific thing. Excuse me. What has become most popular, though, over the last 6 months, I think it's only about 5 or 6 months, really, since we've had this kind of Cambrian explosion of generative AI. Now, generative AI is based on the study of large data sets. So we'll have a large data set, and we'll use techniques like machine learning in order to analyze the content of that data, the content, the relationships, the probability that this should follow that. And by doing so, you can create large language models. And these models really are almost they're very, very complex and genius bits of work, but they are studying billions and billions of different data points in order to give an algorithmic set of tools, the appearance of being able to talk. It can kind of say, okay, in most, if I'm responding to this sort of question, the question probably means this, and my response should probably be something like this, and it's probably related to something like this. So we have these large language models, which are like big data sets. And then we have things like transformers on the top. So GPT is short for generative pre-trained transformer. And what that is a set of incredibly complicated algorithms, very sophisticated, amazing stuff, that will study a large language model, and it will be trained. It will train itself on that data. So if it's looking at Wikipedia, for example, then it will learn everything there is to know about all the content in Wikipedia. It's been trained, pre-trained on the Wikipedia data. And it can transform elements from Wikipedia, so a bit of information about this particular person, and take information about this particular place, and it can then generate new content from it. ChatGPT is just a chat interface onto that transformer, onto that set of algorithms. So ChatGPT is more of an interface into this transformer. So the way to think about these generative AIs in general is that they're recombination machines. They'll take stuff that already exists, find novel relationships between things, and use those relationships in order to try and come back with a response to a question or a query or a problem. We'll go into some specific examples soon. Yeah, ChatGPT is evolving all the time. I'll come back to the future of this. So ChatGPT is, I think, probably one of the most interesting examples at the moment. There are loads, though. This is just one of many. It's adding enhancements all the time. So now, rather than just being able to do text chat and quick question and answer, summarize this text, interpret this text, you can now feed it data or images, and it will then come up with visualizations and responses to that. And it's just starting to be able to do things like go and browse the web. So one of the limitations of GPT in particular, to start with, was that the large language model it was looking at, the data that went into that ended about 2 years ago. So it didn't know anything about the world from 2 years ago. So if you asked it a question about what happened last week, it would have no idea. It would make something up, but it wouldn't really know. But now it has the ability to go off to the internet and get information from somewhere and then bring it back and incorporate it into its response, recombine that information. So where are we? We're at another one of those inflection points when it comes to the world of technology, and they happen with an increasing regularity over the course of the last 20 or 30 years. So the thing that's novel, I think, about where we are at the moment is we have two inflection points which are happening at more or less the same time. So we have a technological inflection point and a socioeconomic inflection point. By a technological inflection point, what I mean is this broad timeline of the development of technology. So when the GUI was invented, the graphical user interface, I mean, I don't know how many of you here remember just having a text-based interface into a computer. You know, when I was at school, we had like the BBC computers and the Acorn Electrons and the ZX Spectrum, that kind of stuff. And you had to do everything with text. There were no icons to click. You couldn't drag and drop things. You know, word processing was not a thing. And then when the graphical user interface was invented, that became a technological inflection point, and it changed the way that human beings relate to technology. It changed the relationship between humans and machines. And then we had the internet, same thing. Changed the relationship between humans and the way they interact with the technological world. And nobody could have predicted at the creation of the internet exactly what we would have ended up with. So making predictions about the future is a bit of a fool's game, but I'm going to have a go in a minute. E-commerce, similarly, another inflection point. Again, I don't know if many of you can remember the advent of e-commerce, but people were scared. They were really terrified about putting their credit card details or their bank details into a web page. It was just a behavior that had never been possible before, and people were understandably really, really nervous about it. Now we don't think about it at all. It's just commonplace and everyday. And that's kind of the sort of inflection point that we're at technologically at the moment. So we had another one with social networks coming along, another one with smartphones being invented, and now we have another one with the advent of generative AI. This is roughly where we are in terms of the inflection point with AI. Development in AI has been going on since the 1950s, roughly, and we've just seen incredible change over the course of the last few months, and it's not slowing down. I'll again give you some examples shortly. So we're about to see a huge explosion in the kind of general ubiquity of artificial intelligence in the things that we do. But we also have this socioeconomic inflection point. So we had the Industrial Revolution, the advent of steam, massively changed the way that entire societies operated, rejigged the whole world order, the social contract. There were winners and there were losers. Lots and lots of things changed. Similarly, then when we started the information age, again, knowledge work suddenly became a thing. Service industry massively changed. Physical industry, in some respects, in some parts of the world, went into decline. And I argue that we are at the beginning, the very beginning of another such socio-economic inflection point. They tend to come in S-curves. I don't know how familiar many of you are with the notion of innovation S-curves, but there will be something new that comes along, and it will be quite slow to start with, won't get a huge amount of uptake, and then it'll kind of start to change everything. Everybody's starting to do it. Think of social networks. In fact, think specifically of Facebook as a good example. So nobody was really using it, and then suddenly everybody was using it, and it's absolutely central to everything that we do. And then people start to get a little bit disillusioned with it. It starts to peter out just as a new form of technology starts to come along that people are really interested in. And sometimes the old ones peter out entirely, like I imagine Twitter will probably do over the course of the next 2 years if it carries on like it's going, and it will be replaced by something else. Sometimes, though, the old technologies continue, and they just modify, they change the way that they're being used. Now, the World Economic Forum talks about this a lot. If you've ever been to the World Economic Forum website, you'll see it's absolutely jammed with content about what they call the fourth industrial revolution. And they've been banging on about this for a long time. And you could argue they do kind of know what they're talking about. They're focused much more on the industrial element, though, in some ways, of the Industrial Revolution. And what's going to happen to supply chains? What's going to happen to manufacturing? What's going to happen to the workforce? I think maybe there's a different way of thinking about this, though. And I've been toying with the idea of calling it the synthetic computing age. Now, this is really to get away from this discussion of artificial intelligence, because it's slightly misleading. In fact, it's very misleading. First of all, it's not an intelligence. It's computation. It's maths, very, very sophisticated and complicated maths, but it's just computation. It's not an actual intelligence. And I think that gives us, and particularly when we're talking to the general public, it gives us a slightly awkward conversation to have. You start having the wrong conversation in some ways, like should they have rights, etc. And artificial is also slightly misleading, because firstly, it's not an intelligence, so how can it be artificial? But this does sort of get into a slightly semantic argument. I think we are at the beginning of a new inflection point when it comes to the socio-economic environment, because we've not just got things like generative AI going on, we've got quantum computing coming comparatively soon. We've also got developments in computation which are related to DNA and light, and so there's more to come. So in terms of an overall categorization of the sort of age that we're moving into, synthetic computing feels like a decent catch-all, which is slightly less misleading. But there we are, that's a semantic cul-de-sac probably. So let's move on and talk a little bit about what are some of the benefits to charities of, particularly generative AI at the moment, just the stuff which has been announced every single day, every minute on LinkedIn and your favorite social network. They fall into a number of different categories. So we have the top one, really, which I suppose is the most obvious, which is it really does help or can help charities do more with less. So this can be improving operational efficiency. In fact, it's mainly about improving operational efficiency. But where budgets are tight, and let's face it, they're getting tighter, and that's not likely to change in the near term, having some tools in your toolkit that can help you do more with less is definitely something worth investigating. And I'll talk a little bit about how you can go about doing that when we get to the recommendations. So doing more with less, what sort of things? Well, there's a whole load. So one of the things I find most useful at the moment in my role is using generative AI tools as a kind of strategy buddy. So I'll have some thoughts about what I think we should be doing, or articulating a problem, or I've got some data where I think, okay, there's some intelligence in here, there's some wisdom in here, I need to extract it somehow. And being able to use these tools to help me form a strategy is quite useful. Or to argue against the strategy that I have come up with. That can be a very, very useful thought experiment and helps you get rid of some of your own biases sometimes. When we talk about the risks of using AI, we'll come back to that. It can be a very efficient way of generating a whole bunch of ideas. It can help you create a wide range of different assets automatically, in the click of a few fingers. So you can do draft copywriting, generate video and audio and graphics automatically. But this. I think most of you that are on this call, there's no need for me to go into specifically all the individual things that you can do, but asset creation is something that is can be massively sped up. Code generation too, if you're developing code. I've been using generative AI to take Python applications and turn them into JavaScript applications, and it takes a matter of minutes. Very efficient. Technical support and internal training, these are kind of related to each other. So I'll start with internal training. So you can direct a algorithm, a generative AI algorithm or set of algorithms at your own data. So you've all got vast resources of documentation, best practice, advice, etc., inside your organization. You can use that as not exactly a large language model, but you can use it as a model that you then use to train a generative AI. So that can help people. There was an example, actually. I was talking to someone the other day who pointed me at this example, and it was using tools like ChatGPT, but an interface on top of ChatGPT, which allowed their telephone support staff to train themselves on a range of different questions that they might get asked while receiving queries on the telephone line or through another support channel. Now, of course, you have to be a little bit careful about this and make sure that your data is absolutely bulletproof, because you don't want to be giving bad advice to people. But similarly, technical support, if somebody wants to get an answer to a particular question, then if you've trained an AI on your data rather than on the data that exists in the world at large, then that can be a very useful onboarding tool for your new staff and really speed that onboarding process. Given that almost all generative AI tools start with a prompt, something that you either write or input or submit, that then the generative AI acts on, act as a lawyer and give me some advice about X, Y, or Z. You can use generative AI tools to help you craft those prompts. So you can use GPT to craft a prompt that you will then use in an image generation tool, for example. That can be a very, very handy shortcut rather than having to learn several different prompt architectures. And there's lots of information online you can find about prompt creation. I highly recommend a course by a friend of mine called Dave Burse, which you can find in LinkedIn Learning. I'm sure we can circulate some links after this. Fundraising effectiveness. So given that it's extremely good generative AI at seeing patterns in data, it's a very useful way to be able to understand your potential donors. If you were to get a generative AI to look at your existing data set, it would then be able to start telling you, oh, look, this sort of person is more likely to be interested in us. This sort of person is more likely to give us a large donation. This sort of person is likely to be, more a better target for legacy giving, for example, versus individual giving. Given what you learn about your potential donors using that sort of approach, you can then use the generative AI to develop a content strategy, for example, to enforce consistency across a whole range of different assets. So you can say, these are our brand guidelines. Create a X based upon these brand guidelines. So you don't have to keep worrying about having a sort of template repository for all this kind of stuff all the time. This is our tone of voice. Rewrite this thing that we want to say using this tone of voice. You can also use it to directly answer questions from donors. Say if you integrate it into a website or part of your customer experience platform, or if you're using call centers, for example, you can have this as an additional tool. And one of the things that I think is most interesting is about being able to automate propensity models. So, if you've got a donor database where you're collecting fundraising information, being able to start to say, look, this sort of person is likely to be a good legacy target for us. That's very interesting as an approach. And none of this stuff costs very much. We'll come on to that again in a minute. There are risks associated with that as well. We'll come on to that in the ethics section. Prioritization and decision making. Now, if you've got limited budgets, limited teams, you've got to make some tough decisions about what you're going to focus on. And generative AI tools can be extremely good at that. So they can automate reporting. If an idea is raised from somewhere in your organization or from one of your sponsors or partners, for example, you can use these generative AI tools to evaluate all your different ideas, wherever they come from, by the same set of criteria, and then say, look, this is the one that we're going to focus on because this one, the probability is highest that this is going to help us achieve our fundraising goals. Or any other goals, in fact, don't have to be just your fundraising goals. There's some very sophisticated Gen AI tools out there which can automate campaign management. If you're doing online campaigns in particular, they can create a content plan for you, a social media calendar, they can write the copy, create the assets, publish it all, and then manage the performance of that campaign. The more features those SaaS tools have, I'm afraid, the more expensive they become, but it's a possibility. Yes, and prioritizing initiatives. These could be internal initiatives too. If you're thinking, should we get into retail, for example, you can use generative AI tools to support that decision-making process, not to take over the decision-making process. This is not a replacement for human intelligence and ingenuity, but these are support tools to help you. You can also enhance the way you're actually doing your service delivery, depending on what that service delivery is, by incorporating some of these tools. So I saw a very good example of it was an organization in America that was trying to help people save money by canceling subscriptions and getting them out of debt, that kind of thing. And they just built some generative AI tools into their website, and it allowed people to upload certain financial information that they had about themselves. Now, of course, there are ethical and security considerations around all of this. This is just to illustrate possibility. And you could upload things like bank statements, for example, and then the algorithms, the generative AI would say, okay, well, look, you could probably save X amount of money per month by getting rid of this, 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 and this, and changing this one to this subscription tier and changing that one to that one. And I've just written you a whole bunch of cancellation and subscription change emails. Oh, and if you want to, I could just automatically send them off to the appropriate person. And just running it as an experiment. The person who created this saved themselves £2,000 a month. So you can create quite effective services for the people that you're trying to help. I did want to include a whole load of different charity examples as part of this talk, but surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, there are hardly any charities effectively using generative AI in a way that is discernible from the outside. So there may well be a bunch of charities using asset creation tools, for example, internally, and coming up with ideas using some of these Gen AI tools. But actually, in terms of public-facing AI services, very, very few to spot. I'm going to move on to the future of AI because I do want to leave some time for questions. I can see there's quite a lot of them backing up. If you do have questions about this, please do let us know so we can address them at the end. The future of AI. Yeah, so prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. This is attributed to all manner of different people, this quote. But I started working on this presentation last week. I've learned my lesson a bit with doing what's the future of X presentations and leave it to the last minute because there's always going to be a change. So I kind of finished putting this together last Friday. And then by Tuesday, a number of the things that I'd suggested that were going to be future developments for AI, a number of them had already happened by Tuesday. So that was great. So I went back in and went, okay, fine. So given that that's happened, which direction do we think it's going to go now? And the following day, which was yesterday, Google made a whole bunch of announcements about what they were going to be doing with AI and had already created some of the things I was hypothesizing would be future developments. So if you're watching the recording of this presentation, some of this stuff may already have happened. It's changing at a rate I've never seen in my time working with technology. But some of the things that we can say about the future is there is a high probability we're going to see increasing levels of ubiquity of AI-enhanced tools or services. Some examples of that. So search engines. So when I was putting the presentation together, Bing had already incorporated GPT because they're a significant investor, if not maybe the primary owner of OpenAI, the people who make ChatGPT. And so they'd incorporated chat features into the Bing search engine, allowing you to sort of ask quite open-ended questions and get some kind of response back. Now, last night, Google announced that they're building it into their search engine too, so you're going to see it everywhere. I think one of the things that I find slightly disturbing, just from a charity point of view about this approach, is it doesn't invalidate any of the effort that you're already putting into things like search engine optimization. In fact, I would argue that that's probably more important now than it's ever been. You want to make your content as machine accessible as possible. But what the search engine started trying to do several years ago was trying to answer a query directly on their portal page, rather than giving people the opportunity to click on a link to send them somewhere else. They were trying to deal with that query in situ and keep them on the search engine rather than send them somewhere else. And with the integration of generative AI, that's likely to become worse, I think. You're likely to see the search engines try to keep more people on their property rather than referring the traffic over to you. They might pull information from your website and display it, but that's not quite the same as, if we want to get people to come and engage with us and, see all the great stuff that we're doing and stumble across interesting things, and importantly, hit the donation button, then that might be a bit harder in the future. We'll have to think of some different ways of doing it. We're likely to see a whole load of different integrations. So Google Workspace, so things like Google Sheets, Google Docs, that is going to have generative AI coming at some point over the next month or so. Microsoft is building it into Office 365, so you're going to see generative AI tools to help you with your PowerPoint presentations and deal with queries in Excel and co-create, pre-create your first draft of a Word document or a proposal. Extensions, so things that will plug into your browser. We're likely to see a lot more of these, I think, and that might be an opportunity for charities to try and get embedded into the browser, the window that people are looking at the world through. Plugins. So ChatGPT started to offer a whole range of different plugins about, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago. I'm still on the wait list for it. I'm clearly not important enough to be able to have the plugins, so I'm a bit fed up with them. But what this allows you to do is to plug in data to ChatGPT from different sources or different parts of functionality. So things like Zapier. Don't know if any of you have used Zapier, which is a service which allows you to connect one service to another service and automate the interactions between them. So when somebody donates over here, update this record in our CRM system over here, and then send them an email, and so on and so on. That's one of the integrations. I think we're likely to see many more of those. And then ultimately, I'd be amazed if we don't see generative AI going directly into the operating system of our devices, whether mobile or otherwise. I know Android, they're building in something in Android to help you write your texts. But I think we'll start to see things going much further than that. Probably see a whole bunch of marketplaces. This is quite typical behavior when there's a new digital technology. Is lots of marketplaces spring up where you can buy certain things or rent certain things. So you might want to rent a large language model, for example. You might want to rent a particular algorithm. You might want to be able to sell something specific, either functionality or content, which can then be processed by generative AIs. So I think some marketplaces we're likely to see. And then slightly longer term, fluid interfaces. So at the moment, we're still using Windows, Windows, monitors, mobile phones. We're starting to use things like voice to text as interfaces a lot more. But I think this is going to accelerate the way that people use and kind of a natural language approach to interfacing with getting things done. So slightly more fluid interfaces, things that can hear, things are maybe like our glasses. We might see a bit of a resurgence in augmented reality. You never know. Or devices, a bit like smart home assistants that can interpret voice in the room. I would be amazed if we don't see a bit of an upsurge in slightly more Internet of Things type devices. Open source, this is interesting. So at the moment, at whatever time it is, 1:30 on the 11th of May, 2023, the big players are dominating the provision of these services. And they're not that expensive for us to use, but the technology has been changing really quite rapidly. And I am already seeing open source large language models that you don't need to pay for, which are much smaller, but in many cases, they're actually performing better than things like ChatGPT, for example. So I think, as soon as things start to leach out into become open source, more widely available to everybody, then you do tend to see them spreading, which leads us back to our ubiquity. I'd be interested to see as well if there's been quite a lot, sort of a general trend away from centralized monoliths over the course of the last 5 years. So things like decentralization and the federation of content. I wonder if we might start to see decentralized generative AI services that aren't owned by any one corporation. You never know. I need to speed up a bit. We're definitely going to see some regulation. Regulation is going to happen. It's unavoidable, I'm afraid. However, it's only going to be effective at a supranational level, I think. You can't really, with something like generative AI, just say, here's the UK's approach to it, and here's the rest of the EU's approach to it. Not getting into the politics of that. Excuse me. This is the US's approach and this is China's approach. That's just not practical with these transnational interoperative systems. So I think there's going to have to be some sort of supranational regulation, a bit like we have with like the United Nations, so the UN Charter on Human Rights, for example, some similar mechanisms and architectures to that. However, human beings and particularly supranational organizations are incredibly slow. And there is no way on earth they're ever going to be able to keep up with the developments happening in generative AI. I can't keep up, and I'm looking at it all day, every day. So what this means is that regulation, or at least rules, are going to be down to us. We're going to have to come up as our own organizations or as groups of organizations. We're going to have to come up with our own codes of practice. and try and enforce them as best we can. The last thing about the future is autonomous agents. Now, this is already happening. What I mean by an autonomous agent? So an autonomous agent, so if an generative AI is a simulation, it's a simulation of human-like behavior, autonomous agents are less like a simulation and more like something that does something. So they'll exhibit reasoning rather than emulation. So being able to have a much more sophisticated understanding of what it is you're trying to achieve. They're saying, okay, this person is trying to achieve this, and we already know this about them. I know their preferences are this, this, and this. And so I think actually what they're asking me is this, or what they really want me to do is this. So we'll have some kind of basic reasoning functionality, but maybe more excitingly or frighteningly is the ability of an autonomous agent to use tools. So having a little chat interface and having something answer some questions is great. But what about when that agent can then open your browser, go to a particular location, it can fill out a form for you, it can sign you up to something, it can cancel something for you, it can compare and contrast a number of different options, it can buy things for you, it can make a donation for you. And we're already starting to see these agents being created. So here are some of the ones which are most interesting. Do Not Pay is the American service I was talking about earlier on, which has created a GPT interface, which allows you to have the agent automatically save you money every month by cancelling things and downgrading things. AutoGPT, Baby AGI, and Agent GPT, there are things that you can probably Google in your own spare time, and there'll probably be another 12 that exist by the end of the week. But these are tools that at the moment, they have quite a high technical barrier to entry. So you have to be able to do things like install Python, or you have to be able to configure a Docker container, or that kind of thing, before you can get them to actually take action on your behalf through the global internet. But I think this will be something that becomes much more user-friendly over time. So we've got another poll that we're going to quickly do. I think we do want to leave some time for questions. So if we can quickly pop up this other poll, and this one is about, given some of the things that I've said, what worries you most about AI, either as an individual or as a representative of your organization. So some of the responses here. So what worries you most about AI? Our lack of understanding, data protection concerns, the speed of change, lack of regulation or guidelines or controls, not having any ability to actually implement anything, the impact on team roles within an organization, or something else, which you might choose to put in the chat. So if you could have a quick selection of one of those, which most closely describes your worries about it. Yeah, we've got a few things coming up in the chat here. All of these things. Yeah, inaccuracy and bias. Absolutely, we'll come on to that in ethics. End users. Cryptic, but I think I know what you mean. Okay. Any last thoughts on the results? Yeah, here we are. Here's the results. Okay, so there's two clear winners here, although there are a number in the chat. So lack of regulation and controls is about 27%, and very closely to that is our lack of understanding, 23%. And then after that, we've got the next two, which are about 15, 19% about data protection and the speed of change. Then we've got our long tail, so around 8%, no ability to implement it, 6% the impact on team roles, and then 3% saying other, and read out a few of those, and they range from inaccuracy and bias, everything on the list, and end users. So let's quickly get into some ethics and recommendations, because I do want to take your questions. I can see loads of them. ethics fall roughly into these kind of categories. The degree to which we're manipulating people, particularly potential donors, when we're using generative AI in a digital environment. So I don't know how many of you remember this from 2015. This is Olive Cook. So she was profiled, basically. So she was in a data set as someone with a high propensity to donate to charities. And that data set was shared amongst a number of different organizations who then all spammed her. I think she had about 80 different organizations. Was it 92? No, she's 92 years old. But she was receiving loads and loads of direct mail every day. And she eventually, whether it's related to this or not, she eventually committed suicide. And this was a very negative news story in the day. Now, the risks of manipulating people's behavior, using dark patterns, it starts off as A/B optimization of what's the best copy on the button, on our donation button. But then you can start looking at people's behaviors, people's motivations, forming models, and then manipulating people's behavior in real time. So we really need to focus on that. Being transparent about our use of generative AI is another one. So this may take the form of simple actions to start with. So things like having a cookie policy, but for generative AI, just being able to flag where and when you have been using generative AI. That is probably going to be the most common approach, I think, to being transparent about what's going on with data and how it's being processed. Inheritance. So yeah, we were talking about inaccuracy and bias here. So because these large language models, the data sets that train the algorithms, because those are from society at large, you've been looking at Reddit, for example, or listening to the music on Spotify, or reading Wikipedia, or looking at Facebook, for example. Those data sets, they inherit the social norms and the bias and the prejudices of society at large. So when an algorithm is looking at those, it thinks that's normal. It thinks that kind of negative behavior or negative attitudes, if you like, are normal. And there are risks involved. It may well start to exhibit some of those behaviors. There are active attempts to work around this, of course. There is an interesting approach from Claude. I don't know if any of you have come across this. So Claude is a kind of alternative version to ChatGPT, but takes a very, very high ethical stance. And they talk a lot about constitutional AI, where it sets the algorithm a whole set of rules, which are all about minimizing the objectification of people, or stereotyping of people, or saying things that are unkind, for example, or hurtful. So again, something that we need to bear in mind, that if you're using these large external data sets, then that's of critical importance, I would say. If you're training an algorithm on your internal data sets, like your support documentation, for example, then it's still a consideration, but probably less risky. And then there's this point about data dignity. This is a term, again, that's been bandying around since about 2015, I think, mainly in regard to social networks. So what happened with social networks is, and we're kind of used to this, we are harvested on most social networks. We're harvested for our data. We get to use the service for free, but therefore we are the product. And so information about how we behave, what we respond to, etc., powers the advertising algorithms and is sold in order that the social network can make a profit. And data dignity is the idea that if something is being trained on your data, or data that has been created by you, that you should in some way be recognized for that and rewarded for it. Now, this might be quite difficult to achieve. Attributing, should this person be rewarded for this answer that ChatGPT gave? That's a very complex area, but I think this, thinking about, are we respecting the data that we're using in order to inform our models and our tools is going to be very important. Right, I'm going to go quickly so we can do some Q&A. Recommendations. Fall into 4 categories. Please get the basics right first. So before you start jumping off and saying, we need to integrate generative AI with our website, for example. Make sure you've got the basics in place first. It's really, really important. Otherwise, you're just going to spin out of control. I mean, loads of the organizations that I talk to on a daily basis will get very excited about the latest shiny object, which is generative AI. That's why we're doing this chat. It's why there's so many people subscribed to attend this particular one. It's really in the public mind at the moment, but you need to get your data sorted first. Any kind of generative AI is going to have to operate on your data. So get your CRM system or your donor database or whatever it is you're using, get that sorted first, get your basic acquisition pathways in place, and then make sure you have a strategy for keeping in contact with people on an ongoing basis. Basic CRM, get that sorted first. Also, make sure you're able to report on things. The number of organizations that I work with sometimes that don't have a unified way of being able to tell what's working and what doesn't work is astonishing. Get that in place first, please, I beg you, because if you're using 25 different donation platforms and you can't tell which one of them is working, then you're just going to waste money and you're going to be less effective. So please get the basics in place first. So once you've done that, then you can start to experiment. So I would highly recommend starting with these. If you haven't started experimenting personally yet, you can try all of these for free. So chat.openai.com, that's ChatGPT. Labs.openai, that's DALL-E, the image generation program. Midjourney is another generative AI for image production, and that uses Discord. So depending on whether your organization allows Discord or not, which is an interesting choice, really. I'm not sure why they chose Discord, but there's probably a technical reason. So I would start having a play with those if you haven't already. If you're interested, though, in seeing, well, what else might it be possible to do? There are lots of websites now, like there's an AI for that. There are lots of websites now which will allow you to just go and say, okay, now I'm interested in something that would help me, create PowerPoint presentations, or something that will help me onboard new members of staff. There are hundreds and hundreds of them that you can have a bit of a look at, and there's no way I can go into every single one of them today. Be advised, though, that if you're using a web-based tool that is somebody else's tool, don't put any sensitive data through it at all. So don't copy and paste a set of records from your donor database into an online tool. I know this sounds like teaching you to suck eggs, but I'd be remiss in my duty if I didn't just say, don't put any sensitive data through one of these generative AI tools, because that data gets sent off to the tool, it's processed, and then comes back to you. So that data has gone out of your control at that point. Now, there are controls being built into many of the bigger players at the moment, which make it less risky. And there are ways to just have a generative AI focus on your stuff, but just be very, very careful when you're experimenting with the tools not to put sensitive data in them. I would also encourage all organizations, given the pace of change that we've got at the moment and what's likely to happen next, I would propose that you get your senior teams to reconsider what creating a charity today would involve. What would it look like? So if you were going to start a charity today, knowing what's coming next, what would you do? Just as a thought experiment. And then start planning. And this is a structured process. Focus on what changes slowly. So rather than trying to keep up with the latest development in AI, because there's a new one every 5 seconds, focus on the things that don't change as quickly. So things like your goals, the organization's goals. Be very, very clear what they are. You can start at a very, very high level and then maybe break them down, but be very, very clear about them. Then clarify people's jobs to be done, the needs that the people you care about have. What are their needs? What are they trying to get done? What is it they do? What is it they want to achieve? So your goals, your jobs to be, their jobs to be done. Be very clear on those because they don't change as quickly as the technology. Then you can start to look at your processes. So how do we currently go about helping people achieve that thing? How do we currently help people do this? Break down those processes. And this is really using service design techniques. If you've never used service design techniques before, what we're talking about here is creating a service blueprint. And it's really just a visual representation of what steps do we need to go through in order to achieve X. So process mapping. What do the people we care about see? And then what happens inside our organization at each of these stages? And then you can start to see, well, are there opportunities to either automate that step, or make that step more streamlined, or make that easier for Jenny in accounts? Because what we're talking about here really is using generative AI to replace tasks, not roles. So we're not getting rid of entire roles by using generative AI. We're just getting rid of those laborious, awkward, time-consuming, complicated tasks that nobody wants to do. And you can't really start doing that until you've outlined what your process really is. What are those tasks? Then you can start to evaluate tools. You can start to say, okay, what tools are available to help us do this, to help us do that, to automate that. And once you've chosen your tools, you can have a little go at making something. It doesn't require huge amounts of technical skill. It depends on your approach, of course. So having wanted to leave a good 20 minutes for questions, I've left 5, so sorry about that. If you do have follow-up questions, we will answer some now, but if you do have questions that we don't get to answer, you can email us and we'll send something around with a written response, maybe with some input from generative AI. So questions?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Phil, for this extremely helpful presentation. You've definitely answered a few of the burning questions I had about AI. So yeah, as you said, we've had lots of questions in the Q&A section already. So can everyone please continue to upvote these questions that you'd like answered first? And Phil has also very kindly shared his email for any questions that we don't have time for today. So I'll dive straight in. The most upvoted question is, for charities with no budget, how do we get started?
Yes, you do this. This is what you do first. So this planning part. Where are we? Recommendations. Here we go. So how do you get started? First of all, if you haven't got a CRM or an analytics, a decent approach to analytics in place, do that first. So don't get involved. Don't get started until you've done that. That's my strong recommendation. Can't stop you, of course. So if you want to, then go and experiment with these tools and just start to get a sense of what's possible, because it changes so much. So it changes so quickly, like being able to upload a spreadsheet, for example. That is a new feature in GPT-4. And there'll be other ones in half an hour. So just go and have a play. It's the only real way to start to understand what the possibilities are. And then follow this process here. Follow this process. Once you start to get a sense of what's possible. Clarify your goals, clarify people's needs, decompose your processes, and then you'll start to say, okay, yeah, actually, in that process, we can automate this. In that process, this can help us. But please do get the basics in place first.
Great, thank you. The next question is, how do we learn about the basics, such as asset creation?
That's easy. So you can go to, there's a number of commercial services, for example. Well, hang on, let me just wind back a little bit. So if you're trying to find out about the specific use of a specific sort of tool, you can just Google it. And I know that sounds rubbish, but if you want to find out what the possibilities are for asset creation, there's a whole bunch of different services. So if you go to there'sAnAIforthat.com and put in video or graphics, for example, you'll get a whole bunch of different services that then you can start having a bit of a play with. Some are expensive, some are free. So things like DALL-E, for example, and Midjourney, they're extremely good at doing graphic creation for free. There's a bit of a learning curve when it comes to crafting the prompt. Dave Burse's course is a very, very good course. It's free at the moment, I believe, on LinkedIn, which allows you to learn about how to write prompts and what sort of prompts can help you. Can they help us with user research? Yes. Can they help us with crafting a plan? Yes, and so on. There's a really good subreddit, r/artificial, is an excellent place to hear about the latest developments if you really want to keep up with it. And I do, sorry, self-promotion, I run a newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks, which is called Digital for Social Impact. And it's just about how to use the latest digital tools to achieve social impact. You can find that at dearson.co. It's free.
Great, thank you. Those are some great tips. And I actually signed up to a newsletter about 2 weeks ago. So I'm looking forward to
Did you?
Yeah, my first newsletter should be coming in soon.
You'll be coming tomorrow.
Oh, very exciting. Thank you. So the next question is, many of the examples you've given would require us to input a lot of our own internal documents and policies into ChatGPT. We're very cautious about doing this. How do we know that this data is kept safe?
Yeah, you don't know that it's kept safe. And if you were going to put it into ChatGPT, it wouldn't be safe, strictly speaking. But there are tools that you can use which will allow you to not put the information into GPT, but to get a GPT-like system to focus on your data instead. Now, there are really simple ways of doing that. There's a service that you can sign up for called, is it called Chat Buddy, or I can't remember. It was in the last newsletter. If you go to dearson.co and check out the last newsletter, then I talk a little bit about it there. But you can just subscribe to that tool, and you can then direct it at a series of documents that are held either in Dropbox or in Google Drive, somewhere like that. And those could be your policy documents. And so you're training a different version of an algorithm that is just looking at your stuff rather than taking your stuff and putting it out there into the Wild West, so to speak.
Great, thank you. And we have a few people following up on your newsletter in the chat, so I'll definitely in the slides and resources tab.
Oh, I feel slightly grubby for having mentioned that, so apologies.
Perfectly fine, don't worry about it. So we have gone over time, but if everyone's free to say, we will carry on with a few more questions, if that's all right. But again, you can always email us, the events page, or Phil directly. So the next question is, what are your predictions on public sentiment towards AI? Social media is a backlash for organizations publicly sharing their experiments as campaigns, such as Amnesty International's recent use of AI images of protests in Latin America, for example. What are the risks for cause-led organizations wanting to use generative AI, especially from an audience perspective?
Yeah. Well, honestly, I think you'll probably know better than me what sort of, what your audience cares about. I mean, do they care about authenticity? I assume in many instances that's going to be a yes, in which case don't make artificial representations of things that are supposed to elicit an emotional response. Like here is something that's going on the ground. Use real assets from on the ground, because of course people would be upset about feeling like they've been lied to. So I think it's a fine line. I think if you've got like core assets and say you've got a whole bunch of photography of a particular crisis that's going on, or video footage, I don't think there's anything wrong with enhancing that or using some of these generative AI tools, like feed the photography in and then say, show me 25 different versions of this, but with a certain call to action or focusing on this particular thing. I don't think that's too bad. It sort of speed up that production, but actually to create fake representations of people, particularly in distress, I think that probably would be reacted to very negatively.
Yeah, I agree. And for the last question for today, as unfortunately we are going over time, Catherine is asking, could you use AI to create a new website structure based on your current user journey analytics?
Yes. Yes, you can. In fact, there are tools out there which will not only create the wireframes for you, they'll create the code. They'll design the entire user interface, create the code for it and the visual assets, so that you could just take it away and publish it on a server. It won't. I would just hang on for another 2 days, and somebody would have come up with something which will actually push it live for you as well and create a domain name for you. So yeah. Absolutely, you can do that. I think what you missed there, though, is, and this is someone who has a background in a digital agency, is that kind of currently the expertise about the user journey or the way a user interacts on a page. That's kind of less good. It will create a page for you, and it's got all the stuff on it that you need, but it might not be the best way of doing it. But then, you could just automate the creation of it, A/B test the hell out of it, just get it to iterate several different versions. In fact, having having a generative AI which would do that job for you and then automatically A/B test it for you and change it to the best one, that's kind of an interesting proposition. But I think having sort of human stage gates is probably the best approach to all of this. It's like, don't let the generative AIs create something and then act on it and act on it and act on it without having human checkpoints in there where you go and review what they're actually doing.
Okay, that's great, thank you. And I'm going to sneak in just one last question, as April would like to know what presentation app you're using.
Oh, right. This is MindNode, mindnode.com, I think it is. I don't know if it works on Windows, works on a Mac. I use it for everything these days. It's just such a quick way to get your brain on a page. And you can just drag things. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do a sales job for MindNode, but it's great. Works on an iPad, works on whatever. You can put images in. You can just sort of drag things around to change the connections, change the visual appearance, and so on. But it's about $20, I think.
Okay, thank you so much, Phil. And I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. So I wanted to thank you and thank the Public Interest Registry and .org Learning Centre for sponsoring this webinar, as well as all of you for being part of today's session on all things related to artificial intelligence. And I hope you found it useful and are now feeling more informed on how AI can benefit your charity. As Phil mentioned, you can contact him via email. And if you could also feedback with us, that would be fantastic. I've pasted a link in the chat, and you'll also receive a prompt just after you leave this page. And finally, our next webinar will be about how to get started on Web3 and AI on the 25th of May. And we hope to see you there. Thank you.
Bye.